Cure by Dorothy K. Haynes. The women came early, calling and crowding at the door. "Are you ready, missus? We thought we'd go with you for the company like, just one or two of us. You might want some help with the boy." She had not bargained for that. All night she had lain awake and worried, and now she had made up her mind. She would do as the neighbours said, but if David was to go, he must go with her alone, so that he could change his mind and run back if he wanted to. After all, he might be 12 years old, but he was little more than a baby. She told them, but they would not listen. "You're too soft with him, Mrs. Weir. I wouldn't put up with his capers." It's time he started acting like a man. With his father gone, you could do with a man in the house. Her lips were white, but she kept her temper, seeing their food on the table and so many other things. The very coat the boy was wearing. "I told you I'd bring him. You can come if you want to, but I'll need time. It's not a thing you can do in a minute." They withdrew, not very willingly, and she stood crumpling her apron, looking down at her son. The clock whirred, but did not strike, and the lid of the kettle lifted on a slow puff of steam. "Come on, David," she said, trying to force a sprightliness into her voice. "Wash your face now. I've warmed the water for you." The boy did not answer. He hardly ever answered, and sometimes she wondered if he heard properly, unless, of course, it was too much bother to him to speak. Everything was a bother to him nowadays. "Do you hear me, son? You can't go up dirty." The child began to blubber. His face turned to the fire. "I don't want to go," he mumbled. "I don't want to." A finger tapped at the window, and a face peered through the pane. And suddenly her anger at the neighbours was transferred to her son, so that, for the moment, the fear of failure was less than the fear of his being a coward. She went over to the fire and shook the snivelling boy by the shoulder. "Get up now, David. Wash your face and get outside. Do you think your father made this fuss when he went?" It was cruel, but the snivelling stopped. Wiping his eyes, David got up and laved his eyes at the basin. His legs trembled, thin as sticks, but he said nothing as his mother brushed the hair out of his eyes and straightened his clothes. "Now," she said, "it's for your own good, son. Don't look, don't think, just walk straight on, and keep your eyes shut at the end." Holding his hand, her own hand trembling, she led him outside, and his weak eyes screwed against the sun. The clouds were incredibly white, puffed up and sailing, the trees and grass too green to be true. He had not been out for so long. The brightness puckered at her own forehead, so that she looked at the ground, and then she forced herself to face the neighbours. They stared at her, impatient, their faces half hidden in their great hoods, and she could see that they were itching to get away up the hill. She did not want to see them gabbing and whispering in front of her. Her lips quivering, she held her son's hand tighter and went to the head of the procession. They went slowly because the road was bad, full of spring puddles and ruts and potholes. There were great splashes of dung where cattle had passed, and all the gutters were swimming. The houses leaned over the street, one side in sun, the other in shadow, and everywhere windows opened and heads poked out to ask questions. "Davy Weir," the women who were following told them. "Going to be touched. Him whose father was hanged." And the word was passed back, eagerly, impatiently, to the old folk by the fire. "Dick Weir's wife, taking her son to the gallows, up to the gallows." Oh, they had heard of it, this dreadful thing, the old superstition that the touch of a hanged corpse could heal. But few of them had seen it carried out. There weren't so many hangings nowadays. There had been no excitement in the town since Dick Weir had been hoisted a month ago, and there were some people who said that the law had been too hard on him. Weir had always been a sober, steady man, but his son was a weakling, never without coughs or fevers or aches in his bones, and the only way for a poor man to get medicine and dainties was by stealing. Well, now that he was dead, it looked as if he might be more use to the boy than when he was alive. It was worth going to find out. The weavers came from their narrow houses, fluff in their hair, their looms silent. The baker left his shop, and a smell of new bread came with him, warm and delicious. He stuck his floury hands in his apron and ambled after the crowd, and the blacksmith left his forge to the apprentice, and the horses stamping and jingling in the gloom. Going to be touched, they mouthed, and nodded to each other. Dick Weir's son, and they shook their heads with the pity of it, but there was a brightness and stir about the morning, just as there had been a month ago, and more of the people followed on. Old Andra, the bell ringer, the two idiots who were propped all day against the church railings, and a squatter of children whose mothers were glad to be rid of them for a while. The woman walked on, leading her son, seeing and acknowledging no one. She had not been out since the hanging, and it was like the first walk after illness, light-headed and unreal. She could not fix her mind on what would happen at the top of the hill, and maybe Dick had been the same. It should have been a comfort to her, but surely he must have realised as the chains were put on him, and he faced away over the wide view. He had always been an outdoor man. He must have screamed and fought, if he were human. She herself, sitting with the boy, had stuffed her hands into her mouth till she choked. Outside the noise had increased and then quietened again, except for one awful sound, like a groan or a sigh, that she heard and yet did not hear. Then the people had come back to the streets again, in twos and threes, but they did not tell her what it had been like. He carried himself well, was all they said. They had been more than good to her. She had looked for work, cleaning or washing at the big houses, but nobody would employ a woman whose husband had been hanged. It was the neighbours who kept her going, with small gifts, oil for the lamp, loaves and logs, and their company in case she felt lonely. Sometimes she almost longed for loneliness. They were kind, but they never left her, talking from dawn till dark. They sat about the kitchen, loath to forget about the hanging, and let the excitement die. She did not want to speak about her husband. What she wanted was quite to remember him or to forget. They asked about David and tried to rally him and laugh him out of his turns. And she could not explain that David did not like to be teased. Everything was out of order. There was spilt milk on the table, and the fire smouldered bitterly. But without the neighbours there would have been no milk and no fire. And then, out of kindness, they made their suggestion, a word, a nudge, a hint behind the hands. They say it's a great cure, missus. Rachel the orphan, they took her. You owe it to your son, missus. What's a wee unpleasantness? He's not too far gone. No, she screamed at them. I couldn't. It's not right. It's his own father, they argued, if you thought anything of the boy. She was angry at that, but they kept their patience, talk, till at last, out of weariness and dutiful gratitude, she gave in. Up past the school where the houses began to thin out, the path mounted the hill. Lambs leaped, wobbly-legged, and the turf smelled sweet. They climbed like pilgrims, stopping sometimes because the boy was tired, and soon the ones behind began to press forward to see what was happening. They looked ahead, pointing to the top of the hill, but Mrs. Weir and her son never looked up. She kept her head down and led the boy by the arm like a blind man. The ground was levelling now, and the wind blew against their faces. The woman felt rather than saw what was about her, behind, the babble of voices, and in front, nothing but a faint swish, like cloth rubbing on wood, and a sickly smell. The boy looked sideways at her, for guidance. His face was sick, green-looking, but she could not help him. She could not lift her hands to cover her eyes, although what was above seemed to be drawing her. She stood there, as if in prayer, and there was nothing she could do, nothing. Suddenly one of the women pushed forward, grabbed the boy by the waist, and half lifted him. Go on, son, up. Let him touch you. Something creaked, and chains clinked a little. Other hands lifted him up from behind, thrusting roughly, hurting him. That's it, his hand. He was light in their arms for all his struggles. His eyes were tight shut, but his fists threshed pettishly, landing weak blows on arms and faces. Higher they pushed him, and there was something on his shoulder, cold, listless, something that slid off again, uncaringly. The boy began to scream, shrilly, thinly, and at the sound his mother looked up, in spite of herself. She made no sound, but her breath gagged back in her mouth, and her face was grey. This limp thing, bumping about like a sack, this was not her husband. If it had been recognisable, it would have broken her heart. Now she felt only fear of it. The thin hair fluttering, the faint whiff of decay as it swung. Even the clamorous women were retreating, their handkerchiefs spread to their faces. The body turned again, grinning, and suddenly she felt herself swinging with it, round and down in a cold dampness and roaring. And then her son was beside her, no longer screaming. His thin arms circled her, his slight body leaned in to support her. There were tears on his cheeks, and his mouth puckered childishly with crying, but there was the first hint of maturity in his face. "Get away!" he shouted to the crowds pressing in to stare at him. "Get away from her! Can't you leave us alone?" "Davy!" His mother shivered and pulled at his sleeve to quieten him. "Mind yourself now, Davy. They wanted to help." "Look at them," he said. Her hands at her mouth nibbling, she looked, and the hooded women stared back at her, callous, curious, licking their lips over the drama. For a moment it seemed to her that the judge and the hangman were innocent, and that these were the real people who had strung her husband on the gibbet. But now it no longer mattered. She stood in a daze, her hands still at her mouth, and her son seemed to tower above her, older, wiser, with infinite power to protect. As he pushed forward, they fell away on each side of him, the weavers, the blacksmith, and the mob who had followed for the fun of it. He passed through them without a glance. They stood for all the things he had learned and spurned at the foot of the gallows: the poverty that forced a man to steal, the cruelty of those who hanged him, and the ignorance of those who, even now, were rejoicing that the touch of a hanged corpse could really heal.